I don't see any phones out. Nice job. It's a pleasure to be with you today. This is campus number 20 this semester. In the last couple months, I've been on 20 campuses. I just came up yesterday from Alabama, where the weather was just about as nice as it is here. I was speaking at Samford University and Birmingham Southern College. Sometimes it's tricky to talk about what I'm talking about in Alabama, but it was a good visit. And I can't think of a better place to end this semester. For me, this is the last campus that I'll be on this semester, and I can't think of a better place to end it than here at Gordon College. And there are a few reasons for that. One is because Gordon has truly been a leader among Christian campuses around the country when it comes to environmental stewardship and sustainability and climate action. Part of that is due to folks like the professors here, Dr. Dorothy Borse as well, and Dr. Janelle Curry, who's your provost, who's my board chair at the Evangelical Environmental Network. And part of it's due to the students, and then a part of it's due to the physical plant. It's really been a team effort here on campus to care for creation, and your leadership has not gone unnoticed around the country. So it's really nice to be here in what I consider friendly territory to wrap up this campus tour this semester. There's another reason I'm really glad to be up here, though, and that's because my parents live here. I'm a missionary kid. I was born and raised in Southeast Asia. My mom's from Malaysia. My dad's from Rhode Island. It's a long story about how they met. But we moved back as a family in 2000, and I finished up my junior and senior year of high school in Acton, Boxborough, Massachusetts. Acton was where we lived, and Acton, Boxborough was a high school district. We got someone here from Acton, Boxborough. All right. Well, I only spent 2 years here, but they've gone on to continue to live here. My dad's a pastor of the Chinese Bible Church of Greater Boston and Lexington. I know we have at least one person in this audience from CBCGB. And it's always nice to come back and visit my family, but this trip is especially meaningful because, and I'm just amazed at how God works out timing sometimes. Tonight, after I get done here and I head home, tonight, my new brother from Haiti arrives into the country, and I'll meet him for the very first time. My parents adopted, he was 15 years old when we started this process. His name's Jude. He's now 17. It's been a crazy process for our family, but basically my brother, who was an engineer and enjoyed being an engineer, not because he liked the work, but because he liked the money and the things that money would do, eventually realized that he didn't find as much meaning in it as he thought he would, and he had a come-to-Jesus moment. He quit his job and went down to Haiti to live and work in an orphanage, and thereby convinced my parents pretty quickly to, well, he tried to convince them to adopt everybody. He's a little impulsive, I think. But they agreed to adopt one, and so Jude comes in along with my father and my brother tonight. We'll pick him up at Logan, and I'm really excited about that. So when I get done here, I'm going to go home, pick up some poster board on the way and some markers and make a sign to welcome him. But at this point, you're probably wondering if I have such deep family roots to the Boston area, and if I graduated from AB, that why and how did I end up all the way at Wheaton College when Gordon is right here? Now, yeah, good question. I figured I should get it out at the very beginning. I ask for your grace that you would not hold this against me. I traveled to CCCU campuses. I've been to about 50 at this point around the country. That's almost half of the CCCU, half of the Christian campus community. And honestly, as I was telling your chaplain earlier on this morning, I can't tell the difference from one campus to another. To me, I know Wheaton has kind of a reputation as being snooty, but I could have just as easily, actually, it's probably better I didn't visit Gordon College, because if I'd eaten in your dining hall and looked out at the beautiful scenery, I might not have ever left. But the reason I ended up at Wheaton and not Gordon is because I followed a girl to college. Sounds like some of you have a little bit of experience with that. My dad thought it was the worst reason ever to choose where you go to college. And he told me so. Son, that's the worst reason ever to choose where you go to college. I didn't realize until this year that the reason he told me that is because he had done the exact same thing when he went to Oral Roberts University in Oklahoma from Rhode Island. But he didn't tell me that. All I knew is he really didn't think it was a good reason to choose to go to Wheaton. But you know how it is. Your head thinks one thing, your heart thinks another, and one of them is going to win out in the end. And my heart won out in this case. It usually does. And I ended up going to Wheaton. And I'm glad to say it worked out just fine, and she is now happily married to my former roommate. They've got 2 beautiful kids. You might not believe me as I say this, but please do. Having lived with him for a year, she made the right choice. I don't blame her at all, and I care about them and respect them both very deeply. And actually, when I was back home for Christmas, they were back home too, and I got to hang out with them this last year, so that was a lot of fun. But with that out of the way, that's really not what I came here to talk about. I came here to talk about climate action and climate change. And yeah, how do you go from that to climate change? Well, climate change is maybe not so much in this campus, I'm told, and that's a good thing, but sometimes a bit more of a controversial issue in the church today. And so as I've been going around talking about this, I've gotten all sorts of responses. And a lot of the time, folks just want to know why I have chosen to take on and why we at the Evangelical Environmental Network and at Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, which is part of EEN, why we have chosen to take on such a controversial issue in the church today. I am one, if you know me, and some of you do, I am one who doesn't like controversy and conflict. I try to avoid it. That's how I deal with it. And so it was really, I didn't expect to be doing this work, but here I am, and here's why. I was an environmental biology major at Wheaton College. And as an environmental biology major, I avoided climate change as long as I could. And I did pretty well at it. I'm not proud of it, because I think this is an issue we should face, we need to face. God's calling us to face it. But I avoided thinking and addressing climate change all the way up till the summer between my junior and senior year. It was controversial. I mean, I knew the science behind it. The science was pretty clear, and it's become increasingly so since I was a student. Excuse me. But when I went to church, it got complicated. And I'm a pastor's kid. I'm a good pastor's kid. I'm one of those compliant, obedient, submissive pastor's kids. And so I avoided dealing with climate change, and I just held it at arm's length. But the summer between my junior and senior year, I was part of a research team. I got to be on this really, really neat team. I didn't deserve to be there. I was funded by the National Science Foundation and some other grants and foundations in the US and the UK, and we were sent over. An international team of professors was sent over to Tanzania, to Lake Tanganyika. Has anyone been to Lake Tanganyika here? Yeah, maybe up there? That's cool. Well, let me tell you, Lake Tanganyika is one of the most remarkable places I've ever been. It's one of the great African lakes. It's a Rift Valley Lake. So it's very long, narrow. It's kind of like a finger lake, but it's very deep. It goes almost a mile deep. It's the second deepest lake in the world. At any given point, holds up to 11% of the world's available fresh water in this lake, and over 100 species of fish, of cichlids mostly, that you can't find anywhere else in the world. It's a really cool place. The visibility is 30 to 40 feet. It's a great place to go snorkeling and scuba diving, unless you have Giardia. Anyone here had Giardia, malaria? All right, well, good for you. I had both at the same time. I picked up malaria, and then I picked up Giardia, and we didn't know that, so we kept treating the malaria, and I still had the Giardia. We thought the malaria wasn't going away, but it was really the Giardia, and one of the symptoms of Giardia is, well, there are a few. There's very painful bloating, followed by very noxious flatulence, followed by explosive diarrhea. Try scuba diving in a wetsuit 30 feet under the surface of the water. I only say this so that you stop thinking about lunch and start thinking about climate change a little bit more. So I was in Tanzania on Lake Tanganyika doing research with this team. The reason we were sent there is because the fishery around in Lake Tanganyika, it's a very important fishery, was collapsing, and people didn't know why at first. The fishery, Lake Tanganyika, is surrounded by countries like Tanzania, which has been relatively stable, but also countries like Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi. These are nations that have gone through decades of civil war and conflict, and there have been many, many refugees that I actually live with next door to in the neighborhood in Chicago where I'm part of an intentional community today. which is crazy. They came from the very, very same beaches that I worked on that summer. But the fishery was collapsing, and this was a really big humanitarian concern because a lot of the people around the lake have fished the lake for generations, depend on it for their primary source of protein as well as their primary source of income. And these are people who can't afford to lose any income. They need more income in order to just send their kids to any school beyond primary education, which is their only hope for a way out of the situations that they often find themselves in. So the fishery is collapsing, and they sent a team of folks, and I was just the field rat. As an undergrad student, I did all the dirty work. I loved it, though. I was on the fishing beaches every morning as the fishermen came in with their catches and their dugout canoes. Dugout canoes are nothing like the canoes we have in this country. First of all, they're really tippy, and second of all, they're really heavy. But these fishermen would go out in the evening with all their nets, and they'd lay them in the lake, and then early in the morning, they'd go back out, and they'd pull all their nets in, they'd bring them to the beach, and then they'd spread them out and sort through the catch. And then they bring it to the market, which was really just down the street, and it was just blankets laid out in the dirt. And the fishery was collapsing, and we were trying to figure out why. And so part of my job was to be on the beach and to record everything that these fishermen were bringing in, and the size, and then to figure out sexual maturity. Don't ask me how you do that. That was a really painstaking process of trying to cut these little tiny fish open and identify where the gonads were and compare them to the size of other But I got to be in Tanzania, so it was worth it. But it was, we figured out, well, the team figured out what was going on, and it took a few years to do it. But once the data backed up, we realized that Lake Tanganyika is a really unique lake. It's an oligotrophic lake, and I'm using words like oligotrophic in front of a limnologist right here, so I'm going to be very careful about how I say it. But it means it's a nutrient-poor lake. It's very clear water, very deep, and it shouldn't be very productive. It shouldn't have such a vibrant fishery. But the reason it does, because you need nutrients from the basis of any food web, any ecosystem. And so the more nutrients you have, the more algae you have, the more little things that eat the algae, the more little fish that eat the little things that eat the algae, and you get the idea, it all the way goes up. And Lake Tanganyika should not have had a very productive fishery. But every year at the right season, seasonal winds would blow across the lake, and they would be sustained and strong enough that over a time, they would actually back water up at the end of the lake. It's kind of like a tide, except it's driven by the wind and not by the moon. It's remarkable, and it actually happens. I didn't realize until I came back on the Great Lakes and Lake Michigan in Chicago, where I live. But it backs the water up on one end. And what that does is it causes upwellings to take place where the nutrient-rich water from the depths, there's no oxygen below, but there's plenty of nutrients, will upwell up to the surface and bring nutrients to the layers of the lake at the top that have oxygen. So it causes this great mixing, and the nutrients then feed this huge and vibrant ecosystem, which then powers the fishery. Well, here's what happened. Over the years, there's been a warming that's been taking place in that region that's consistent with the global warming averages that we've also measured. And that warming has caused the seasonal winds to cease, effectively, to not blow as sustained and as strong as they always used to. Without the winds blowing, that lake isn't mixing the way it used to. It's a very deep lake. You can't just stick a pole down there and mix it up, or a paddle. This is a lake that's almost a mile deep, and without that mixing, the nutrients haven't been making it to the surface, and the ecosystem has been starting to collapse from the bottom all the way up. And so fishermen, fishing the same way they've always fished on this lake, aren't catching the fish that they used to be. So that was a bit of a explanation, but I could give it because it's in English. I was on the fishing beaches one morning, and one of the local fishermen came up. I had known him a little bit because I'd seen him from day to day as I was on the beaches. He was a refugee from Congo, and he asked me, why am I not catching these fish anymore? Now, he speaks Swahili, and I speak Kidogo Sana Swahili, less now than I did when I was in Tanzania. And so for 5 minutes, I tried to say what I just said to you in Swahili and explain global warming in Swahili. I didn't do it very effectively at all. And so he was very patient, but after about 5 minutes, he said, okay, never mind. What do I need to do to fix it? What would you have said? I didn't have an answer for him. He wasn't the one who caused the problem. He was feeling its impacts, but he also didn't have the resources to really do anything else. I had no answer for him. But when he asked me that question, I realized I made those connections. They happened right before me. And I realized that I could no longer avoid climate change. This isn't an issue I could just say it's too controversial and I could be dispassionate about it. Because now it had a face, it had a name, it knew my name. And I realized that climate change wasn't just a scientific issue to be studied and solved by the scientists or the politicians. It was a human issue. It was a matter of life. It was a matter of justice. It's a matter of loving our neighbor. I came back from that trip, and I wrestled with that question for a while. And then I started to look into climate change. I started to read. I started to study. I started to talk to folks. And then I started to get active. At the Evangelical Environmental Network, one of the things we do is we partner a lot with relief and development organizations that work all around the world. You've heard about some of these like World Vision and World Relief, Food for the Hungry, Bread for the World. Actually, in 2 weeks, I'm taking a team of church leaders from the United States, including folks like Cameron Strang, who heads up Relevant Magazine and Relevant Media Group. We're going to Malawi in partnership with Tear Fund UK, which is an evangelical relief and development organization. We're going to Malawi to see the impacts that climate change is currently having on people and communities there on the ground. And that's the bad news. But we're also going to see the good news of what the church there is doing to partner with communities to help them respond and to help them adapt. Because here's the thing, if you were to ask me, when I thought of global warming, what would the picture be in my head? You know what picture I'd have in my head? First, and it still does this. When I say that, immediately in my mind I see a polar bear looking very sad, sitting up top of a floating block of ice that's slowly sinking and melting into the ocean. And you know what? It is about the polar bears. And if and only if, for that reason, because it's about the polar bears, I think Christians should care. Because God made the polar bears. God cares about the polar bears. And we really don't need any other reason other than God cares about it for us to care about it as well. But what I learned on that trip to Tanzania, and what we now talk about as we go around to different campuses and churches, is that climate change is not just an environmental crisis. It's also a humanitarian crisis. And as such, I think as a church, we have a little bit more experience in responding to humanitarian crises, don't we? So, what does this mean for you? I know this is Chapel, and I know at Gordon, because they do a good job here in Chapel and beyond, I know that you hear from any number of speakers every year telling you that this is an issue, that is an issue, this is an issue that you really need to care about as a Christian. And I know the feeling. I know what it can feel like to be overwhelmed and inundated and just feel like you're sinking amidst the amount of need in the world today, and you lack the capacity. You're just trying to get good grades. I don't know how many of you have quizzes later on this afternoon, but I understand some of that tension. So what does this mean for you? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that, climate change is connected to just about every issue out there. We can't pick one issue to care about and then just say, well, this is the issue I care about, and therefore I don't really need to care about all these other issues. I think climate change, we talked about human trafficking. Climate change is connected to human trafficking, and that's the reason why we are working at times with IJM these days, International Justice Mission, to figure out what we need to do, how we can work together to address it. Because one of the things that climate change does is it dries up people's water sources, which means that women and kids now have to walk further during the day in order to get access to water and bring it back, which means they're more vulnerable to being kidnapped in war zones and conflict areas. The other thing is that climate change intensifies all the other effects people are facing, and so a lot of these folks grow their own food. And if climate change dries up their land, they're not able to grow food anymore, certainly not at the level that they used to, and families get more desperate. And it's in these very situations when families are desperate that they are vulnerable to hearing really good sales pitches from people who say, well, here, sell your kids to us, and we'll take them to a better place where they can get a good education, where they have a hope and a future. And it's hard for me to blame parents who try to do what's best for their family and for their kids. So climate change is connected to human trafficking, it's connected to poverty, it's connected to development, it's connected to war, it's connected to all these issues. And here's the other thing, we all have an impact on this planet by virtue of being alive. We consume resources, we produce waste. In Tanzania, I produced a lot of waste. Sorry. And because we are human beings, because we are God's chosen people to care for this, He intentionally, deliberately entrusted this planet and its people to our care. Because of that, we all have a responsibility. As much as we impact the planet, we have a responsibility to steward the planet as well. And so this is not something that's only for science majors. It's not something that we can get away from. And climate change is a huge issue. It's an overwhelming issue. I struggle with that. We need action from everybody at every level without delay. And at the end of the day, I can't tell you, well, go home now and change the light bulbs in your dorm rooms and everything will be okay because we know, who am I kidding? You can change the light bulbs in your dorms, in this campus, where you probably already have in most of the campus, at your homes where your families are, at your churches. You could change all the light bulbs in this country and we'd still have a problem. I've changed all my light bulbs. I bike most places now. I eat lower down on the food chain, unless someone puts beef on my plate, in which case I happily eat it because I really like beef. I've made all these different individual changes in my life, and we're called to. That's important. We should be making those changes. They're part of living faithfully before God. But I know at the end of the day, if I just focus on what I can do as an individual and I leave everything else out, well, guess what? The planet's still warming. Oceans are now 30% more acidic than they were before the Industrial Revolution, because they're absorbing a lot of this excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. January of this year marked the 335th consecutive month of globally warmer than average temperatures. What does that mean? That means if you, and most of you I think would fall into this category, were born after February of 1985, you have not lived in a month that was cooler than average. You've only lived in a month that was warmer than average. Global warming is all our generation has really ever known, and we're starting to see those impacts, and they're starting to come home. So now that I've hopefully sufficiently overwhelmed everybody, before I send you out to lunch and to your tests and quizzes and papers, I'd like to offer you three thoughts on how we can go about responding in a way that might be more biblical and less overwhelming. The first thought I'd like to offer you is that we don't respond to issues like this or any of the issues we're talking about out of guilt. I get asked that a lot. I got asked that in Alabama. How do you avoid guilting people into doing the right thing? And guilt has a role to play, just like the law had a role to play. And I think they're actually pretty similar. But we don't respond to guilt. We respond to love. We are called to be motivated by love. We are called to be a people of love. We follow a God who is love. When people ask me why I care about this stuff and what at the very core of my faith motivates me, I said it's very simple. When Jesus asked what is the most important thing, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I can't claim to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength today unless I care for this planet that he created, that he sustains, and that he's redeeming. And the second is like the first. I can't claim to love my neighbor as myself unless I also do something to address my impact on them, on their lives, because of the ways I consume and produce waste. We can't do it. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it's a chapter that I'd encourage you to read and read and read and read and then memorize and then recite and recite and recite. And it starts out this way: if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And it goes on. Anything that we do that does not come from a place of love, anything that we do that is not out of love, that is not motivated and guided by love, I believe misses the mark that God has called us to. So respond out of love, not out of guilt. And there's great freedom there. And the second thing I would say, so the first is to respond out of love, not out of guilt. The second thing I'd say is to think relationally about this stuff. I'm not going to give you a list of 99 things that I'd like you to go out and do now. You've heard some of the things that I've done in my life to try to help make a difference and to live faithfully. And I know you could all come up with a list of 50 others, I'm sure. But sometimes we take these lists of things to do and we go out and we start checking through them, don't we? And we make some good progress. It's like weight loss. Something else I'm figuring out right now. We check off, let's say, the first 20 things, and then we go to bed at night, and we wake up in the morning ready to check off the next 20 things. And on our way to check them off, we realize we violated half of the first 20 things that we checked off, and we haven't even got to the next 20. And there are 50 more to go in this week alone. And don't think of a checklist. Think of this relationally. We are called to live in right relationship with God, and Jesus Christ makes this possible. We are called to live in right relationship with one another. We are called to live in right relationship with this planet, this creation. So what can you do to live more in a right relationship with God, with our neighbor, with each other, with God's creation, with yourself, for that matter? Think about it relationally. And that connects to the first point, which is to love. The final thing I'd leave you with is that the need is endless. It's overwhelming, and it will never cease to build up. And if we are responding to need, I'm writing a book right now for the same publisher. Actually, that's what I'm going to be doing after I finish the poster this afternoon, is try to catch up there. And the working title is Surviving Activism. Because I think sometimes we don't get this right. And a good friend of mine, Tyler Wick Stevenson, has just published a book that is very helpful that's titled The World Is Not Ours to Save. And we forget that sometimes. The world is not ours to save. But we follow a God whose job it is. We follow Jesus, who is saving the world. And that frees us up not to respond to need, but to respond to calling. You can't do everything, but you can do something. What is the something that God is calling you to do? And that's what I'd invite you to think about as we wrap up today. What is the something that God is calling you to do here? Ask that question prayerfully. And when you receive an answer, and Jesus promised that if we ask, we will receive an answer. When you receive that answer, do it. Because if you know what is right to do and you do not do it, that is sin. We also read in the New Testament. So when God gives you that step, take it. And then don't stop there. Ask the question again, what is the next thing that God is calling me to do? And then take that step. And keep asking that question and keep taking those steps, just as you do in any part of your life and in your faith, until the very next step brings us before God himself. And by the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, we hear, I hope we all hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Now enter into my rest. But it doesn't stop until then, and we can't stop until then either. So what's the step that God is calling you to do? What is the step that God is calling you to take as you leave here? There's so much you can do on this campus, and Earth Week is a great time to figure some of that stuff out. You could get involved with ASF. You could come to lunch, and we can talk more about different things that you could do. A year ago when I asked this question, the answer that I got, along with some other young evangelicals, young Christians, is that we were concerned that we weren't hearing climate change being discussed in the church at large, and we wanted to bring the conversation back. We wanted to figure out what it means to respond faithfully to an issue, a crisis that we're going to be living with and dealing with for the rest of our lives, and that we believe the church should be at the forefront of. And so a year ago, the next step for us was to, and this was a big step, this was bigger than I usually take, was to form an initiative called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. It's sponsored by the EEN, who I'm on staff with, and that's the reason I've been going on to all these campuses and churches and trying to bring that conversation about climate change back. That was a step that I'm still taking, and I'm still trying to figure out. And we'd love to have some of you be involved in that. So again, come to that discussion after lunch. And in a moment, we're going to show you a video to end that talks about Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, who we are, what we're doing, and maybe a little bit of how you can get involved. But before that, I'd like to leave you with this. Remember that though the stewardship and the service that we offer is intended to benefit our neighbors and God's creation, the offering itself is one that we direct to Almighty God, the creator, sustainer, and redeemer of all things. May he find us faithful, and may his kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven.